Before Talos became the Ninth Divine, before the name Septim had ever been uttered, but only after the Elysian Empire had fallen to the wayside, there was the Riemann Dynasty. Created by a mythic figure, every bit as mysterious as Tiber Septim, the Riemann Empire would rule Tamriel for generations. Its armies would face down the living gods of the Tribunal at the height of their power, and march across nearly every region of the continent. But even the Remans, the victims of court intrigue and insidious power plays, would fall. This is their story, and the story of the last year of the Second Era. The Riemann Dynasty began with Riemann Cyrodil. Much of his early history is lost, and what's left is shrouded in mythology. The Riemannata, an obscure tome that claims to offer some insight into Emperor Cyrodil, paints Riemann's birth as being the result of divine intervention. It claims that Saint Alesia herself, the founder of the first human empire, appeared from the past to create a son with Riemann's father, King Heral. Whether this is to be taken as literal fact, or a metaphor for Riemann simply being descended from the Elysian bloodline, and thus being destined to restore the human empire to its former glory, is unknown. It's also possible that Riemann was simply the illegitimate child of Heral and a Nord woman, with the story of his divine birth thus being a clever attempt at the later emperor to prove his claim to the Ruby Throne. Riemann would eventually be declared Dragonborn at the Battle of Sancretor, where the Akaviri invaders would recognize him as having the dragon blood and pledge their loyalty to him. The Akaviri Dragon Guard would eventually become the Blades, but what's of more note here is that Riemann being Dragonborn does line up with him being descended from Alesia, as she herself bore Akatosh's blood. Regardless of the verifiability of his divine birth, Riemann would prove to be an excellent tactician and leader. Through guile and clever strategy, he would bring nearly the entirety of Tamriel, with the exception of Morrowind and Blackmarsh, under imperial rule. Whether Riemann was truly the semi-divine hero son of a saint, or an extremely clever man and propagandist, either or both would go on to make him an excellent ruler. Riemann's direct successor would unfortunately prove rather impotent. Emperor Kastav's poor handling of a rebellion in Winterhold, and a long list of other issues, would eventually lead to him being deposed shortly after his reign would begin. It would be the first emperor's grandson, Riemann II, that would provide the empire with a course correction. His first major act as emperor was to negotiate an end to the aforementioned Winterhold rebellion, which had been a result of Emperor Kastav's policy of forced Nordic conscription. Riemann II would finally annex the remainder of Blackmarsh and reconquer the lands that his predecessor had managed to cede through incompetence. Riemann II is noted to have been particularly concerned with the well-being of the people he brought under his banner, and quickly inspired loyalty in his new fiefdoms. It was this Riemann that started what would become known as the Fourscore War, in an effort to finally conquer Morrowind. At the start of the war, Riemann II had managed to restore the treasury and troop reserves of his family's empire. However, the war with Morrowind would drag on long past his death and prove to weigh heavily on his heirs. After Riemann II fell in battle with the forces of Morrowind, he would be succeeded by Emperor Basilius Dor. Unlike his predecessor, Emperor Dor preferred to make merry, rather than advance the good of the empire. He was known as a drunkard, and his only noted contributions were to the arts of feasting and debauchery. He did have a habit of leading his troops from the front, however, at least whenever he could be dragged away from the imperial palace. The last emperor of the Riemann dynasty was Riemann III. He inherited a war which had lasted nearly 60 years by the time of his crowning. The armies of the empire were depleted, along with its pockets, and it seemed to many that the war with Morrowind would never end. In order to stabilize the growing discontent in his war-weary empire, Riemann III was forced into a political marriage with a noblewoman named Tavia. He would have a son by her, but their marriage would soon fall apart, likely due to a combination of the emperor's trademark paranoia and his seeking of other women's comforts. Despite this, and the fact that his empress would actually eventually turn against him in response to being placed under house arrest in Blackmarsh, Riemann could not rid himself of Tavia due to her powerful allies and wealth in the Colovian estates. By the year 2920, Amalexia of the Tribunal would have a vision that she would share with her lover Vivek. She spoke of an end to the long war, but she said that it could only come to pass if the third living god of Morrowind, Sothasil, returned to the homeland. In response to her visions, and at Vivek's request, Amalexia agreed to travel to the Somerset Isles to retrieve Sothasil. Sil had been absent from Morrowind for nearly 17 years, when he had gone to study with the Sigic Order on the Isle of Orteum. You can learn more about the Sigics and their old way in our video on Manamarco, the God of Necromancy. As we said, Sothasil had become a teacher on Orteum, but by the time of Almalexia's visions, he was undertaking a much greater task. In response to the destruction of Girvardel by the Daedric Prince of Destruction, who had been summoned by the Mad King of Sinchai to destroy it over a poor ballroom performance, Sothasil would venture into oblivion and stand before its 17 princes. The Dunmerry mage god would spend years, although only days passed in real time, in oblivion brokering a deal with the Lords of Change to ensure that the princes did not interfere with the mortal realm for the remainder of the war. By the terms of their deal, the Daedra would no longer broker with amateur summoners for the agreed-upon duration, but could still be called to the mortal realm by certain covens and experienced practitioners of conjuration. When asked what he'd been forced to give in payment to the princes, Septims declined to answer. While his counterpart was pushing forth the mortal agenda in Oblivion, Vivek was leading his armies against the Imperials at Bordrum. An incredibly intelligent tactician, Vivek would have his soldiers carve 1,000 spears on the eve of a battle, and would expertly steer the conflict into the flood pan beneath a dammed river. When the Imperial vanguard charged, Vivek had the before-mentioned dam destroyed and washed away the Empire's spearheading force. Upon being washed downstream, the unfortunate Imperials would be skewered into a floating wall of sharpened sticks. With their forces broken up and cast into chaos, the Imperials would be entirely routed and pushed into a forced retreat. Lord Vivek employed a number of spies in order to anticipate the time and place where it would be best to engage the Imperials. One such spy, who would provide the information on Imperial troop movement needed to win Bodrum, was a Breton man by the name of Casser Whitley. When asked why he wanted to betray his empire, Casser replied that it was for the money, and because few spies ever got to ply their trade for a god. The Battle of Bodrum would cause Vivek to place greater faith in Casser, and to invest more into his reports in the altercations to come. The next major conflict between Vivek and the Imperials would occur near the fortress of Al-Marak. Casser would report to Vivek that an army of Imperial battle mages was amassed at the edge of the nearby Lake Caranti. Seeing as Casser reported that the mages had no boats, Vivek assumed that they'd be forced to go around the lake and to cross the straits nearby. Unfortunately for Vivek, he would later receive reports that the Imperial army had somehow bypassed him and destroyed the remainder of his garrison force at Al-Marak. Vivek would question Casser in a rage about the nature of the battle mages he had seen, only to discover that the spy had misidentified their crests. The battle mages were not war wizards at all, but alteration mages that had cast a spell of water breathing on the Imperial army that had allowed the forces, led by the Emperor's son, to cross underneath Lake Caranti and completely avoid Vivek's own warband. The Imperial forces would then go on to seize and occupy Al-Marak. Because of this, Casser would be banished in shame from Lord Vivek's sight, and forever be referred to as the worst spy to ever live. It would be the Akaviripotenate, a snake man who administered the empire for the Remans, as had been the tradition since Riemann I, that would report news of the prince's victory to the emperor. The potentate would claim the credit for the prince's ingenuity and strategy. At the same time, the potentate would turn the emperor against his most favored mistress, presenting evidence that she had conspired with a poisoning plot that had been meant to kill the prince. The emperor, ever wary of traitors, would quickly have the woman imprisoned despite her pleas of innocence. The potentate would then convince the emperor to have his former lover's sister, a priestess, brought in to replace her. When the emperor would visit his imprisoned mistress to gloat at her failure to damage his rule and inform her of the summoning of her sister, the woman would attack Riemann III and claw out one of his eyes in a rage. In Mournhold, meanwhile, another mistress was being banished. Tarala of the noble house Redoran had become pregnant with the Duke of Morrowind's child. Being of the house Indoril, a rival to the Redorans, the Duke would become fearful of the implications of such an heir and banish his innocent mistress. Tarala would likewise be disowned by her own family and sent to wander Tamriel in excommunication. After banishing his pregnant lover, the Duke of Morrowind would take matters into his own hands to end the war. The Duke would attempt to hire a Morag Tong assassin to sneak into the Imperial Palace and put an end to Riemann III, who was recovering from the injury his mistress had inflicted upon him. Septims would learn of this and seek to end the foul maneuver by meeting with a being known as the Night Mother. He was, however, told simply that the Tong would not cave to supply and demand and the offers of more gold. They had been hired to complete a job and, once they received the payment in a week's time, would certainly complete it. In response, Septims would intercept the ship carrying the Duke's gold to the Tong from a vantage point where he levitated high above the open sea. Sil would encase himself in living fire and manifest the form of a raging Daedric lord before sinking the Duke's vessel in payment to the bottom of the ocean. Once the gold was set to never reach the Tong, thus voiding their contract with the Duke, Sil would remark to himself that everyone, in the end, caves to supply and demand. Despite Sil's voiding of the contract with the Tong, the Emperor's wife would be putting plans of assassination all her own into motion. Tavia had hidden away her vast wealth from her husband for years, and, with her long confinement finally turning her into the villain he feared, she would send one of her most trusted retainers to meet with and hire an Imperial deserter to assassinate the Emperor, whom she believed, in response to her son's victories, would be meeting with Vivek to discuss a treaty in the days to come. On the eve after their battle at the lake, Vivek and the Prince of the Empire would sit down to discuss such a treaty. The Prince would ask only for the coasts of Morrowind to protect from foreign Akaviri invasion, and in return, he would offer Morrowind the protection of the Imperial Navy. Vivek would be impressed by the generosity of such an offer, and by the prince himself, agreeing to a temporary ceasefire between the armies, while he and the prince further discussed an end to the conflict. To the prince's dismay, one of the imperial legions not directly under his control would sack and take the Dunmeri fortress of Blackgate shortly thereafter. This was a clear violation of the armistice between Vivek and the Emperor's son, and the prince feared that it would lead to a total breakdown in negotiations. While Blackgate was being sacked, fate would cause the path of Vivek's fired spy and the Duke's banished mistress to cross. Kassir and Tirala, who had been forced to give birth alone in the wilderness, only being saved by a wild Ayleid elf who helped her to deliver her child, would journey together until being saved from an orc warband by the priestess of a coven of witches. Tirala and her child would remain with the witches, and Tirala herself would show such talent as to be proclaimed by the coven's priestess to be destined to one day succeed her. While Tirala was finding a new home among the witches, the Empire's prince would be calling a hasty meeting with Vivek in response to the breaking of their ceasefire. The prince would apologize to the Dunmeri lord and claim that he had no knowledge of the attack before it had happened. He would say that he retained the authority to act in his father's stead, who was still recovering from the loss of his eye. Vivek would judge these words to be true and agree to the terms of peace offered by the Empire's heir. The two generals would put their commitment down upon paper, and the prince would promise to bring it to the imperial city to be ratified. It was at this time that the prince would receive a messenger from the empress that she requested his presence. The prince would then leave Vivek and begin on his way to the nearby swamps of Blackmarsh, but he would be ambushed on the road, his retainers disappearing from behind him into the night. The prince would attempt to defend himself, but he would be felled by his assassin nonetheless. An assassin who would soon realize he'd murdered the wrong man. The prince had been carrying his injured father's shield as a symbol of office of sorts, and the man whom the empress had charged with killing her husband had instead slain her son. While the prince lay dying in his own blood, alone on a Morrowind road, the spy Kassir was beginning to realize that Vivek's telling of his mistakes would forever prevent him from finding work. Enraged at the Lord of Morrowind, the spy attempted to employ summoners to call down the Daedra on him. Unfortunately for Kassir, he would soon learn that Sothasil's covenant with the Lords of Oblivion prevented them from working with all but a few select conjurers. Kassir would be disheartened at first, but he soon remembered that he knew of a witch coven that was friendly towards him. As fate would have it, Tirala would be away from the coven for a time, having left her child in its protective watch. Kassir and the now powerful witch would meet again on the road as they once had, with Tirala being the one to invite Kassir to travel with her this time. When they made it to the coven, however, Tirala would find that the nearby orc warband had slain everyone present, to include her child. Horrified with grief, and seeking a target for her rage, Tirala would believe an opportunistic Kassir when he lied to her and told her that he instead recognized in the orc's work the signature of the Duke of Morrowind's assassins. Fueled by her own immense talent and unimaginable fury, and her hatred of the Duke, Tirala would then use all that she had learned to conjure forth the Lord of Destruction, Mehrunes Dagon, and summon an avatar of his form onto the mortal plane. The avatar of Dagon would utterly destroy Mournhold, and it was only after it lay in ruins that Sothasil and Amalexia would find Dagon among the still smoking rubble. Sil and Amalexia would declare then to the prince that while they could not truly kill him, that he would soon regret that fact. Thus two living gods did battle with the Prince of Oblivion amid the ruined corpse of their once great city. In the end, it was Amalexia who would defeat Dagon, but only after suffering grave injuries that would put her into a coma for weeks to come. Upon receiving word that her assassin had killed her own son, the Empress felt all of the light go out of her own life. She would task her faithful retainer again with hiring an assassin to kill the Emperor, who she now also partially blamed for the death of their son, but this time she would direct her retainer to hand-deliver the remainder of her wealth to the Morag Tong. The Tong would accept the contract again, but this time would receive the payment for it directly, claiming that the Emperor would be dead by the end of the year. The Empress, meanwhile, would step from her balcony and fall to her death the same night she dispatched her emissary to meet with the Tong. With the foul agents of Mafala finally compensated for their contract, it was only a matter of time before Riemann III would fall by their hands. It would not be the first time that the Tong killed a sitting emperor, and it would not be the last. In the end, it would prove to be the very sister of the emperor's executed mistress that would cut his throat. She would hand him a letter with only the seal of the Tong upon it, before dispatching the regent with a small knife that she'd concealed beneath the missive. With the Riemann Dynasty having no emperor, no empress, and no prince to take the ruby throne, it would be the Akaviripotenate who would instead take over rulership. He would not crown himself emperor, but he would rule in all but name. The deaths of the Remans would herald in the final days of the Third Era, and the beginning of a long series of Akaviripotentates. In truth, it had been the potentate himself that had framed the Emperor's mistress, and who had allowed the Tong's assassin to both get close to the Emperor, and to then escape after committing regicide. Ironically, it would be the Morag Tong who would assassinate the last Akaviripotentate, and murder all of his heirs in one bloody night. This would usher in a period of turmoil known as the Interregnum, and put an end to the already crumbling Riemann Empire, which had only survived through the rule of the Akaviripotentates. During this period, the Amulet of Kings would be lost, Cyrodil would erupt into a civil war between the East and the West, and Morrowind would be forced to repel another invasion from Akavir. It was also during this time that Dagothera would re-emerge and cut the tribunal off from the heart of Lorkhan, the divine source of their godhood and power. After the fall of the Remans, the world was struck into chaos, and only the rise of a new emperor could bring Tamriel once again into order.